And hey, welcome back to another episode of the Starbright podcast. This is, if I'm counting right, I think this is episode 17, if I'm not mistaken, so I'm doing pretty good. We're unfortunately missing Drow. I think we will be missing Drow for the foreseeable on and off future. I think he's come upon a bit of a scheduling kink. Haha, kink in the schedule. Ha ha ha. I'm so funny. With Friday nights, and hopefully either he's able to work it out, or we'll have to end up finding someone else. Unfortunately, which would be very sad because Drow has been pretty good, pretty great having. But I'm sure we'll figure it out. He might pop in at some point tonight if we're lucky, but quite possibly we will be just flying with us three for the night, I think.
He did make a post a couple of days ago on his Facebook that he was going to be stepping back from a lot of social media, so that may also be part of it.
Yeah, I think a lot of the running pages things, people don't realize how busy you can get, and then you have the expectations that you have to do all this and that and make all these posts, and it's a large part of why I don't run a page right now. But like, other than working so much and not really having all that much time for it during the week, so but like, yeah, it's a lot to deal with. It can be stressful, and if you're not like a super on top of it kind of person, it's gonna run away from you, and you're gonna feel like it's running away from you, and you're just not gonna be able to keep up with it. And I
A
think
lot of people don't
maybe that's why
realize just how demanding it is. Like, I'm not just
wholeheartedly.
making memes and having a good time. This is actually something that is almost like a part-time job, and sometimes even a full-time job, depending on what all you're doing. It's very, very time consuming.
You're having a good time. You're not supposed to have a good time. You're supposed to be miserable the entire time.
Oh, for sure.
What's wrong with
It's capitalism. We must suffer the entire time.
you? Correct. All right, so tonight's episode, if I remember correctly, and Mouse, I don't know if you remember correctly, this is a topic you wanted to kind of go over. It's the old guard versus the new. The difference between the generations, I guess, would be maybe a more succinct way of putting that, more explainable, I guess. If
We were
that would
also
be a way to
thinking of
define it.
just explaining what it is. Old guard isn't necessarily supposed to be an all-encompassing term, but it is one that I use as all-encompassing because they're like the old guard and we're the new guard coming in and slowly replacing them over time, which, it's not a great way to look at it, but it is something that I think we should discuss because there is a huge difference in understanding of what kink is, kinks that were common back then but aren't common anymore, and like how those understandings can impact communication between the two generations.
See, I wouldn't even necessarily put it as just a generational thing. I'd say it's more like a series and set of expectations and beliefs about how kink works. And then,
Yeah.
because there are young people that, kind of display those same expectations and beliefs about kink. I've definitely heard,
Uh,
people around my age, younger, parroting very wrong information
well,
about
I think
consent. That's a big.
yeah, the consent thing is a big thing. I think another thing is we have to be very careful because a lot of the old guard, the older generation, are the people who are writing some of the resources out there. And oftentimes I come across resources that look like they're good and they have great reputations, but I'll read their blurb about something and be like, oh my God, I really hope nobody's taking their information from this because that is dangerous. Or that is like no longer something that is socially acceptable. Like if you're doing this with somebody who's under the age of 30, you're probably going to cause harm or upset them or get yourself in trouble. A big difference would be like the understanding of bratting. The understanding of bratting for somebody in the old guard versus modern understandings is vastly different. We've had discussions on this before. One of the things that I
Someone coming
see
out and saying that CNC shouldn't have safe word.
Oh God, yeah, that was. We'll probably discuss that at some point tonight, just because that has
still
recent.
terrifying.
Yes, and their understandings of slave relationships. I've actually seen screenshots from their page about discussing slaves, and I was horrified. Also, that page mentions Gurian slave dynamics a lot, which is honestly the most incel shit I've ever heard in my life. And it's so weird and creepy. And I don't have an issue with a lot of things in kink, but that particular one just seems dangerous and not good to me. And I have my opinions on that. And, not to kink shame, but like also this one just seems really dangerous. Do you have any? You have opinions on this one, I'm sure too, right? Like Gurian, like I had an idea of what it was, but the more I looked into it, the more, oh my God, I got.
I mean,
What all is it?
Gurian. It's Gurian slave girls, and it's where a lot of the modern understandings of like poses for slaves come from is actually from this dynamic. And the issue is a lot of people can't actually find girls willing to do this, so they have like entire like groups of it. Is it on Second Life or something? Where they
Yeah,
have this
that's a
like
big resource from, yeah.
yeah, that's like where a lot of it is because they can't actually find women who are actually willing to participate in this. Which I find honestly very telling about why and where that's not acceptable anymore. Because if you can't find any girls in the modern era willing to do it, maybe it's because it's outdated and weird.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, I've said it before is that a lot of expressions of kink, are things that in other contexts would be, awful experiences. CNC is one of them. One of the reasons why we want safe words
Hmm.
in the scene, because like it's just rape. Other than that, and
Hmm.
and things like if you're in like a slave master dynamic, poses like that. Well, it's not really much different than there are ways of doing bondage that are extremely painful to the person, being
Yes.
tied up. Because as much as it is an art form, as much as it's turned into an art form, it was also originally exploration for torture. How to tie someone up in the most painful way is was a large part of
And
where,
shameful way.
yeah, and
Yes.
shameful way is a large part of where that came from. And if you don't know
What
what you're
I
doing,
will
it's a large
say,
part of the reason why you need to do research before you want to be a rigger, is because that can be very painful. And
mhm,
and like
I
painful
think it's
poses, that's no
important.
different.
I think it's also very important to know that a lot of the modern things that we have in kink that are like very explicit divisions that are really brought or spread out are things that originated in practices that the old guard is very familiar with, or things like Gurian. A lot of things in Gurian are actually used in modern concepts in kink, but you don't really see Gurian being used in modern kink. Like pieces, it's been taken apart piecemeal. The poses are used, like some of the dynamics, like sexual slavery, collars that don't come off, posing, presenting yourself, all of these things that are very common in this dynamic, harem dynamic specifically, are used in modern kink, but you don't actually see that very much the newer generation. Sorry, choke there. Um, I don't think I've ever heard of anyone under the age of 40 practicing Gurian. Have you?
No, not specifically. Absolutely not.
I've never heard of anyone practicing it in anything akin to my age range. I've known about it. It was something I was familiar with, and I knew of it as an obscure form of slave kink, but I never actually looked into it until it was brought up, and it was heavily favored by this creepy page that I was talking about. And I looked into it at that point, and the more I found, the more I was like, "Oh yikes! This is like the type of dynamic I would expect a Reddit dom who's grooming an 18-year-old to be into." Like
Yeah, and
that's the kind of thing that it rubbed me as, and I was like, I don't like this.
there are a few things that are seem to like very kind of old guard specific. And again, I don't want to. That doesn't mean just older people. You can totally just think it's totally normal and be indoctrinated into those kinds of beliefs and
Yes,
expectations regarding kink, even when you're young. But like, I mean, we discussed it. I think in the different type of DOMs episode, we discussed
yes.
like leather DOMs and whatnot. Like that's very specifically like leather obsession is something that's also very specific. I think to the old
You
crowd.
don't really see it in modern
No,
kink very much. Like we have like leather concepts, like some leather bustiers, dominatrixes still sometimes wear leather, but you don't really see it as a thing in modern kink.
in
We
and
don't
of
usually
itself,
see,
no.
It's
yeah, we
more
don't
of
usually
just an
see,
accessory instead of
yes,
the
like
reason.
full gimp suits show up periodically, but they're less common 'cause they're stupidly expensive and they usually end up coming off anyway. But you usually see that in the context of like some sort of humiliation anyway. And it's not the main focus, it's like a sub focus of achieving the end of the other kink. And that's usually where you see leather. Like some people like the aesthetics for bondage, some people like the aesthetics for certain types of play or the feel for certain types of play. But there really isn't a leather kink so much in modern kink. You don't really see it very much. But old guard, like there's a reason it is a stereotype. It's because old guard was big on this. And I want to make a quick division. Like a lot of times when I say old guard, a lot of what comes to mind is like boomers, because there are boomers who are still in kink. But also some older Gen X members tend to be really firmly in the old guard. And even some extreme elder millennials can be, but you don't see it as much. My generation, I am an elder millennial, not the eldest of elder millennials, but I am an elder millennial. And my generation is usually far separate from them. Not always, but generally speaking, anyone in my generation, an older millennial and younger, does tend to be more so in the newer guard. We are not practicing the things that the boomers and Gen Xers were to the same degree.
I mean, we were kind of the demarcating line between the older generation and that kind
Yeah.
of boomer
We were
ideology,
the
and
first
everyone,
generation to really talk about the
yeah.
newer types of consent and make that such a huge focus.
And not that there aren't older people that, aren't totally on board for, the new expectations and new rules and new lines of consent
I
and things like
agree.
that. But like, it's not,
I would say our entire thought about kink seems to be around consent, as consent being the
yeah.
primary driver of kink, whereas that was not the thought prior.
Oh, and maybe this isn't fair to say, but it seems like the old guard, they're much more obsessed with the act itself, instead of like the person that you're doing that act with,
I
or
agree with
people.
that too.
Right. So and that's the whole thing why, come upon people who don't think CNC should have safe words, because, that makes the act itself feel much riskier, because it is much riskier because you're doing it wrong
Hmm.
and it's unsafe now. But that's fine for them, because that means the experience is more towards what they expected, what they want it to be, more dangerous,
Hmm.
more exciting and whatnot. But
It's
like,
very
Yeah.
selfish.
yeah, you can't act like you're
I
caring about the other person if you're taking away their actual
yeah.
agency to put a stop to the events going on. And that's
I
that's
think a
the whole.
lot of this comes down to us drawing the line and changing our entire conceptualization of kink. We no longer see kink as kink itself. Kink in and of itself, from the perspective of the younger generations, we see kink as consent first. The consent is sexy. The consent is the part that matters. Everything is built around this idea of what you've consented to. And if anything is outside of that, we don't see that as kink. That is criminal. That is that is taboo. That is outside of what's okay. And that seems to be less of a solid demarcation for people in the older generation. They seem to think that this is weird and we're being snowflakes and babies. And we can't understand it. It's like, why would you want to be in something where consent isn't the primary driver? And it seems to be a complete worldview shift between the generations. And in some ways, I can understand it. But in other ways, I honestly feel like we need to just excise that some of these cancerous things that are just dangerous, especially if they're being used to teach younger generation members.
I
Now,
think it's. I personally, just to throw my 2 cents in there, I think it's kind of a trauma response, because, the older generations, they're people that have been through things that, and wars much more, not to knock modern
oh yeah,
combat, but like people who went through Vietnam, and it's like they have permanent flashbacks. They can't stop that. There is no safe word for that, and they just have to learn to deal with it or not,
yeah.
as it
I
comes
think it's
upon.
not
So then
even
they comes
just
to kink, and it's like,
war.
oh, you should just, no, it's not. But it's just
Yeah,
that kind of thing where, I had to deal with it. I had to learn to deal with it or not. So you're
yeah,
just gonna have to learn to deal with it or not. And
yes,
if you want a safe word, fuck you. I don't have a safe word for my thing. So why should you get to have a safe word for yours? And it's kind of just like this selfish, childish, pithy, you know, fuck you. If I have to be in pain, so do you, kind of thing.
yeah. I also think it's just like it wasn't as acceptable to have these conversations about consent, and consent wasn't taken as seriously. Like a lot of these people are coming from a generation where if a woman was raped, they go, "Well, what were you doing? What were you wearing? Like, what were you doing out that late? Why didn't you plan for this better? Or like, why didn't you make sure you had somebody to drive you home? Like, you shouldn't have been out that late." And that's not necessarily the way they are thinking personally, but they were from generations where that kind of thought about victim blaming and rape blaming were very centered around what were you doing to be in that position rather than well, it's awful that somebody violated your consent and your autonomy in that way. Or what do you mean you were drunk? Well, I mean, she was drunk, but she said yes. These conversations about consent didn't happen until later, like in our generations, the later millennial generations, where talk about these kinds of things became more commonplace. Also, we are from the era of the internet being very common, so these conversations can happen easier and on a wider spectrum. So I
Yeah, I
think
mean,
there's major tone shifts that happen generationally.
yeah, and I mean, I think a lot of it can boil down to the whole mental health situation that was going on in the country, because I mean, up until like maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, it was verboten for a long time to talk about mental health, and I think a lot of those issues come down to that because if you're mentally healthy, you're not going to be selfish. You're gonna care about how the other person feels and how they're doing, and so of course you would
Hmm.
respect that agency. They need a safe word. They should feel safe. They should feel happy with what's going on. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And not having that, there was 40 years where you couldn't get treated for mental health without someone thinking that you were weak, that there was something wrong with you. You know what I mean? Like, and there are still plenty of cultures, and it's not just an age thing; it's a cultural thing too. There are cultures that still think that is not like it's not acceptable to talk about your problems.
Yes.
So that's still part of what drives younger people even still going along with those very old and very outdated expectations when it comes to kink, because they still
Yes.
think, oh, screw your mental health. Your mental health has nothing to do with it. It's about the experience. Screw making sure everyone feels safe here. And it's just kind of very sad.
I agree entirely. And I think one of the things that came up when discussing with this creepy ass page, I'm going to keep referencing him as the creepy ass page. So first of all, I can't remember how to say his name correctly most of the time, so I'm not even going to try. It's Whips and Chains and something. He does a podcast, and he kept posting episodes about his podcast, and they kept getting sent to me because people were seeing red flags about it. And one of the things he was talking about is a slave doesn't have any right to privacy. Any privacy that the slave has is a gift from the master, or like
Bruh.
reprogramming your slave to have the mindset and the limits that you want them to have, because that's what true slavery is. And I'm sitting here, holy shit. First of all, you're assuming that this is going to be full TPE 24 fucking 7, and then that person has no right to be away from you, and anything they do have as their own autonomy is a gift from you. No, you're a fucking psychopath. That isn't even kink. That terrified me, because that's not within the realm of anything I've ever recognized as BDSM.
No, it's actually just a natural extension of a very unhealthy and toxic way of looking at relationships that people have. Totally vanilla,
Yeah.
because there are people that think you belong to your partner belongs to you. As in like
So,
you should be bound at the
with,
hip. No one's allowed to do anything
yeah,
without consulting the other. Yeah, and it is very toxic and unhealthy. And that's just a more a more extended version of that, essentially. That it has nothing to do specifically with kink, but it is not healthy.
yeah. And once I saw that he was posting things like that, I was suddenly like, I can see where the consent thing comes up, because like he doesn't seem to realize that a person should and could have autonomy within a dynamic, and it doesn't have to be 24/7, that every moment I have that is not directly controlled by you is a gift. No, I'm allowed to have autonomy as a human being if
I
and
mean,
when I want it.
look at it this way. There are parents that treat their kids like that. I'm sure you've heard stories about parents
Oh
that
yeah.
didn't let their kids have doors to their rooms and shit. Like that
Mm-hmm.
that is surprisingly more common than you'd think, and it's an
This it
awful way to
is.
treat it.
Whole time as y'all have been talking, like the trends and stuff kind of match up for me comparison wise to a parent relationship between all the generations and how things
Yeah.
have shifted.
Yes.
As we have learned more recently with every generation, just more about consent and that what's right and wrong to do with our kids and raise them type thing, and how
Hmm.
that's kind of reflecting in the kink community too. And
Yeah.
again, boomers have a problem. Why can't we spank our kids? It's just discipline. No, it's not. They're not
Thank me,
learning
not your
anything from
kids.
that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Please. I would prefer, like, I actually I had this little rebellion in the school I was in. I jumped around schools a lot for a little while when I was in my late teens. And I ended up in this one little Christian school that had or corporal punishment as a policy. And I walked into the room, and I forget what I'd done, but I think it smarted off to somebody because they'd said something really shitty to me. It was a teacher had said something really shitty to me, and I smarted off because, of course, I did. It's me. And the principal of the school, a 65-year-old man, told me to lift my skirt so he could paddle me. And I said, Sir, I will shove that clean up your ass. Fucking try me. And he ended up realizing very quickly that I was dead fucking serious. I was going to take it out of his hand and beat the shit out of him with it if he tried it. And he decided it was not worth spanking me. So he just suspended me for a day. But I was not about to fucking play that game with a 68-year-old man that I'd never met. I just met him a couple of weeks beforehand. He was the pastor of the church the school was in.
Damn.
He asked me to lift my skirt to get paddled, and I was like, fucking try it. see what happens. See what happens. Like, and that was something that was acceptable in the past in a lot of schools.
And we have
My great aunt
we have a viewer
stopped
who said in the
teaching.
chat that their dad used to tell them that they were lucky that he didn't put a camera in their room to protect them.
Oh,
And
holy
yeah,
shit.
that's not. I have heard stories of parents doing exactly specifically that.
Hmm.
Random
Yeah.
fucking TMI of me growing up. One time, I don't even remember what I did for this to have happened, but like I was literally hands, feet taped, and I got beat with a belt, chased around the house.
Yeah, because for whatever reason, that was considered acceptable in past generations. And as people get older, usually you see, I think there's even a great historical example of Queen Victoria. She was raised in this system of, I forget what it's called. I know about the story, but I forget exactly what it's called. It was some sort of palace system where she was raised in such an extreme solitude oriented, silence oriented way that she didn't get to have a childhood. So when she had her kids, she very quickly brought them in like she had her own nest where her kids didn't get married till much later in life. And if they did get married, she was just hyper focused to the point of it being extreme on all of their lives and all of their grandchildren. And it was a reflection of how vastly oppressed and disturbing this was for her as a child to live through this. So she changed it. There's a lot of events like this in history where you can see people looking at how they were raised and going absolutely fucking nut and going the opposite direction. And I think that that is reflected in our generation, like how we're handling kink. Like, yeah, I have a daddy kink, but let me tell you, if anyone actually acted like how some of the parents in the past acted, they wouldn't be my daddy for long.
Don't touch my fucking thermos.
Oh
No,
my God.
a lot of us prefer the caretaker, a good,
Yeah.
and that's with any relationship too. That's you need the aftercare for after it. If
I
there's
think
no,
it's pretty telling that daddy kink is so common now because, like, I think that's probably speaks a lot to like how we were raised. That kind of care and attention and support wasn't something a lot of us grew up with. Like, I think that there's probably something to be said there. It's like it's our kink because it's something that we seek because it's something we didn't really have a lot of previously.
And
And
I
I
mean,
think there's something to be said for that.
I mean, it comes. Well, I would say you're mentally correcting for a lack of something that you should have had growing up. You know, the way that you should have been raised, and but it's the same in reverse. You know, people do that because they feel a lack of control in their own lives, so that's why they
Mhm.
try and control everything around them. If they're it's their partner, and especially if you've already have them in a slave master dynamic. You're not going to feel so bad if you have like serious control issues, where let's just take that to the logical conclusion where no, I control every aspect of your life, you have no privacy, because that lets you experience that control that you feel that you don't have. And same thing with your kids. Take their door off their room, put a camera in there. You need to control them because you don't have control in other aspects of your life, or you didn't growing
Yeah.
up, or wherever that was coming from, that made you express yourself that way. And it's just because it's untreated. Because I mean, people don't just go out into the world and go, oh yeah, I took the door off my kid's room, I put cameras in their room. I can't say that. I've seen people on Facebook boasting about it,
Yeah.
but for the most part,
Mhm.
you don't talk about it because that's disgusting. And so
Exactly.
no one ever checks you on it, and you just continue these disgusting things towards your kids, or towards your partner, because there's no one there to check you on it, and you just have raging, uncontrolled, untreated issues essentially.
I think we also have to talk about like the difference between like things that are kink and things that are very much so not kink but are being used within kink to make it seem okay. And one of those things is that extreme level of control, or oh, my kink is for my sub to not have safe words. These things are not kinks. And just because somebody says, well, my kink is, doesn't make it a kink. We have to understand that kinks have limitations on what they permit. Like, you don't have a kink. Sometimes you are literally just a psychopath who has a kink for hurting people. And we have
Yep.
to make that that delineation right there because it's so important. You can't just say, "Oh, well, my kink is insert XYZ criminal abusive activity." No, that's not a kink. I would argue that you can't really have a kink with unless it fits within the framework of BDSM, of the accepted uh, guidelines within BDSM, where it has to be able to be done safe, sanely, and consensually, or,
Yep.
have some sort of consent. If consent is not possible, that is not a kink. And we need to
Hmm.
stop letting people say, oh, well, my kink is. No, it's not. You're just an abuser that needs to abuse people to get off. And that probably means you need therapy.
Yep.
Yep. You
Like,
have a abusing fetish at that point, and you
yeah,
need
if
therapy to
you're
assist with that.
if you think that you're being kink shamed for being told you need to have consent and safe words and safety measures in place, I've got news for you. I can't possibly be kink shaming you because that's not a kink. You're just an abuser or somebody who has been so victimized by this abuse that you are now trying to normalize it to cover up the cognitive dissonance you're experiencing by being told that this is abusive.
Yeah, and
Because victims of
people.
abuse will try to hide just how abusive an action is because it was something that was so common for them. They would have to recognize themselves as a victim before they could admit that they were abused. And that is something they cannot mentally do because it would be too painful.
Yep, and it's the same exact excuse that people use when they're called out for being shitty towards their kids. Oh, they're my
Hmm.
kids. Don't you don't tell me how to parent. I'm the parents. I know what I'm doing.
Oh,
I'm
I
I'm
got
I'm
spanked and
raising them.
hit every day, and
Yeah,
I turned out perfectly okay. The
and
fact that you're telling me that tells me you
yeah,
didn't turn out perfectly okay,
it's
though.
it's like you're not parenting, sir. You're just abusing. That's not You're not teaching your kid. You're
Or the
not telling
whole,
them.
you'll understand this when you're older.
Sir, I'm
Yeah,
actually
that's
quite a bit
bullshit.
older than you think, and I still think you're stupid. Okay? Just to put that out there. I love that too, because they are always like, what are you, 12? Sir, I'm almost 35, and I still think you're fucking stupid.
Yeah, and I that's that, and especially when it comes to parents, that was a big thing for me growing up. My parents were, neglectful in one way, and then complete, invasion of privacy the other way. So, I learned the only way I could really have super much privacy was to just not be in the house. I stayed with a friend for 2 weeks in high school, and they didn't
Yeah,
even know I was gone, for example. And that was
I had
the best
runaway
time I
issues
had
in
in high
high
school. It was
school.
great, but
I had runaway issues in high school because my mom is extremely controlling, and
yeah,
I would just get up and leave, and nobody would know where I was.
yeah, you're not actually teaching your kid anything. Just the same thing. You're not helping your partner enjoy anything if you're fucking removing their agency. And
Hmm.
I hate, especially with the privacy thing. I hate it when parents do that because I, if you want your kid to function as an adult when they grow into an adult, you have to treat them as an adult in most ways before they get there. And if you're like, oh, my
Yeah.
kid's not going to have a door on the room until they're 18, what the fuck is that? They're not allowed to have privacy until they're a grown adult, then they won't even know how to deal with that when they're grown. Like
I
you've
also,
removed their ability to grow into.
riffing off of what you just said, I'm actually going to give a couple of hot takes that all are off of the same thing, but come back to the central point. Um, with the whole idea of grown-ups are meant to teach their kids to be adults before they become adults, a lot of people have this idea that in schools we should being taught taxes and like how to do certain life skills and things like that. But there's actually a reason those things aren't actually taught at school. They were supposed to be taught at home. They were things that people assumed when these school system designs were made that your parents would teach you because the schools are only meant to give you an education. Your parents are supposed to prepare you to
Yep.
become adults. These are things that are designed and intended to be taught at home. Like a school is not supposed to prepare you for adulthood or for life after. They're supposed to give you the skills you need to work to get a good job, to higher level function things. Like they don't expect parents to be able to teach you to read at home. That's something you learn at school. But things like doing your checkbook, learning how to balance a checkbook, doing your taxes, learning skills. Like a lot of these things are things that it was assumed when the school system was designed you would learn at home. But our generation, it's foreign to us. Like, well, I don't understand why they didn't teach us something useful at school. Well, that's not what schools were designed for. That was never the intended purpose of them. The schools were taught to, or invented to teach you academics, things like math and reading and sciences and things that your parents probably wouldn't know a whole lot about to teach you. But your parents probably knew how to do a checkbook and they probably knew how to do their own taxes. And for whatever reason, they failed to pass that information on to you. Now, there's a lot of reason for that, especially in lower income neighborhoods where the parents were probably working too much to have the ability to do these things. And there's a lot of arguments for like having those services provided for you through school or through another institution. Like I'm a big fan of like libraries teaching these skills, but that's a different conversation. But the reason I mention this is we seem to have a different understanding what parenting looks like in our generation than in previous generations, because boomers were taught these things. But for whatever reason, they didn't teach us. So we had a completely different relationship with our parents than the boomers had with their parents, and going back, because we had a different type of parenting instilled upon us. And a lot of it was controlling and taking away doors and
Yeah.
micromanaging our lives, but not actually teaching us the things that we need. So if you look at like why schools are run the way they do, you kind of can see that there's a huge gap in how when schools and public schools were invented and like actually teaching students were learning these things at home. So why weren't we taught these things? And what it is it is a gulf between what parenting looks like between generations. Our
Yeah.
parents weren't parents, they were almost sort of our nemesis growing up. Like they were trying to micromanage our lives, control us, prevent us from quote unquote doing wrong. And it's probably a response to like they didn't get those things growing up. They got nurtured more so. And we did not get that. So I think
Arguably, that kind of applies to old guard too, yeah?
yeah,
We're not
yeah.
really being taught why. And I think that's the big thing. This generation really just asks the question of why are we doing this? Not just to do it. Why wouldn't we have consent to do
Exactly.
this?
And safe word.
And safe word. So why is the leather kink so focused on type thing? And it might be
Hmm.
just why those are all kind of falling out of style.
Hmm.
Not
For us,
mainly the leather king, not consent and stuff,
yeah.
but yeah.
I would say that a lot of the things that we no longer use within kink, we've recognized that first of all, they just work better in subspaces, like different areas within kink. Like they're things that are fun and can be very sexy, but are usually sub-spectrum things in a different kink. Like bondage with leather is different than bondage with rope is different than bondage with chains. And those are all like subcategories within bondage. But no one really does leather on its own. And like Gurian was a very common previously used slave dynamic, but we don't really see that anymore. It's just elements of it that have been piecemeal picked up by other forms of slave dynamics. And I think that it's something we should really work on tonight is actually explaining to people like how to recognize some red flaggy. This might have been written by an old guard things. So people don't go into it going, oh, well, this is obviously like hard and set rules. This is like good information about kink. I think that we should probably give some ideas on how to recognize that that's kind of red flaggy or
Well,
how to know that you probably
I
shouldn't
would
take that as
say
gospel.
number one way to recognize it would be the level of control expected, because if anyone is coming at a relationship, whether it's your personal relationship with someone, or a BDSM dynamic, or any kind of relationship you have with someone, where the expectation of control is so absolute that the one person is going to lose personal agency, that's written by someone that just does not have your personal best interests at heart, because they can't, because they're taking away your ability to make your decisions completely and totally. And so if someone has written something, whether it be about CNC or bondage, or even just in your normal total vanilla relationship, someone goes, oh, yeah, you should hand all finances off to one person permanently. Don't even think about it. One person should control that. No, that person is not going to have your best interests at heart. That is immediately and definitively not someone who is helpful to you. That is someone coming from that old guard style of expectations, and it's not current or up to date, and it is not healthy. And you should not be handing complete and total agency over to someone else.
Hmm. I would also argue. I would also argue very strongly that if the emphasis in your article you're reading isn't all about the consent, you should probably not read that article. Also, anything that's like super black and white, like a real sub doesn't do XYZ, or, there's been conversations about whether or not a brat is a real sub. I see this one a lot. Like, are brats actually real subs, or are they just poorly behaved subs? No, bratting
Ugh.
is just a form of interaction. Like if you dislike brats that much, it tells me it's the same way people dislike cats. If somebody dislikes cats, I assume it's because they can't stand not having direct control and worship from something. Like cats will love you and like be affectionate to you, but not to the degree that dogs usually will, where they're like up your ass and you can do no wrong. Cats will see you as a human. Dogs see you as God. And from my perspective, if somebody's treating brats as if they are bad subs just because they don't do as they're told all the time first time, that just tells me they have control issues. They value their worth based off of how readily somebody's going to obey them. That's why they need a sub dynamic. The second somebody tells me they don't like brats, I really question who they are, because that's a red flag to me. Like, it's one thing if you don't want it, like, as a dynamic, but if the first thing you say is, oh, I just really hate brats, either you've met a bad brat or you are not the person I thought you were and I need to reassess.
Yeah, I mean,
Oof.
imagine shitting on someone just because they express themselves in a way that you don't personally do. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of people that paint. I don't paint, but I'm not gonna shit on people that paint. You're like, oh, painters are always the worst. Like, bro, they're just painting, and like, and that's also really single fucking dimensional too. Like, just because a person's
Mhm.
a brat doesn't mean bratting is their entire personality. What there's
Yeah.
no other aspect of them that they have to
I
themselves. They're
discussed
only
this in the brat episode. Bratting can take many different forms. When you say you hate brats, are you saying you hate bratty littles? Are you saying you hate like full on brats? Are you saying you hate bratty primal brats? I don't know. Like, what is it you hate? And if you get into it, a lot of times you get down to, oh, well, they don't listen. Okay, so you just want something that's going to obey you first time? Doesn't seem like much of a challenge, does it? Okay, I mean, if that's your thing, whatever. Or other times it's like, oh, well, they're really, really mean to me. So you just had a brat who abused you. Or you just don't like it when people make fun of you, which, probably get a thicker
oh,
skin or
bro, yeah.
like something. But like a lot of times it's something like they either had a really bad experience with somebody who was being a bitch in the guise of a brat, or they have issues with like not being listened to, which is usually a red flag. Um, or when people are like, oh my God, I just really hate daddy doms. Why's that? Well, why do you really hate daddy doms? Oh, well, they're just this is they don't really dom them. So you hate soft doms too? Like, what's your issue? Because not all daddy doms are soft doms. Some of them are pretty hard doms, and it can be really, really traumatic to go from like daddy doming to all this and they're in hard dom mode, and you're like, holy shit, what the fuck is this?
I think
It's a
the
big
big
tone shift.
red flag is using strong words like that. Hate.
Yeah,
It's
anything that's like that black and white, I'm generally
Yeah,
kind of
it's not
hand
absolutely.
off there.
respectful. It's
Yeah,
just it
yeah,
shows they don't have a respect for the other sides of kink, I don't think.
yes.
And they're
I would
already kind
argue
of crossing a line for a lot of people out there.
they
You
are.
don't know if the person you're trying to talk to and communicate with to get into a scene, it they may be a daddy. Who
Yeah,
knows? And you're saying all of this to them. Now you're cutting yourself off from a whole side of the scene when that's not all that they might be.
yeah.
But
I would argue very strongly. There's only a few things within kink that we should be very black and white about. One of them's consent. If you don't have consent, full, full stop, full stop. But in general, if something's not your thing, don't use strong language about it. Don't be like, oh, well, everyone who's into primal is just like a monster. Oh, some of us are monster fuckers. Okay, get over it. Get over it. That kind of thing. But the big thing for me is like things that are taboo, things that do not have consent, things that are really dangerous. We should use more black and white language about it. Like, I'm not going to be like, oh, well, I'm not going to judge somebody else's dynamic because like we don't understand it. And if they've consented to it, well, full stop here. You can't actually consent to something like that. And I think we as a community need to be aware and able to call this out when we see it. Like, no, somebody can't actually consent to a scene where they can't pull out if they feel unsafe. Oh, well, they consented. They should be able to have their CNC scenes without safe words if they want to. No,
Not
they
how that
shouldn't,
works.
because that is rape. That is rape. So let's not pretend that that's okay, or like be like, oh, well, that's how their dynamic works, and I'm not going to judge them. No, I absolutely will, because that's an abusive relationship. Like, hard stop. If
I
they can't opt to pull out when they feel unsafe, that is not consent.
I'd say that another red flag is any kind of sign of not just about control, but like any kind of sign of like abusive, like unbalanced mental health issues. People like saying things or doing things that just seem absolutely insane, or participating in things that seem insane. Like we didn't mention this in the taboo episode, because I forgot about this one. Maybe I should have brought it up at the time. But there is a kink called feederism, which is a very weird, which
Hmm.
is when someone wants to just watch the other person eat, essentially. And it is completely non-sexual in and of itself. Um,
Hmm.
and But like that can have physical health ramifications. But
Yes.
there's an aspect of feederism where sometimes people just want to watch the other person eat themselves to death and stuff, and that has nothing to do with sex. That has, while it is a kink in and of itself, it's not about that. That is some unhealthy obsession, just in terms of relationship dynamics to begin with. And if you see someone with that kind
Hmm.
of level of unhealthy, like mental imbalances, like just stay away. That's someone who's not doing self-care, not recognizing the harm in themselves that they are then expressing upon others. And that is very
Yes,
much like an old guard type of thing, I guess I'd say.
I would agree. Some of the things that I have been made aware of, spoken in previous episodes about experiences I've had with the old guard. Like that's why I don't go to a lot of physical munches, because there's old guard there, and I would just rather not, really, because there's some weird things that the old guard is like totally okay with that doesn't necessarily translate well to modern generations. If I know that the event or venue I'll be at will be predominantly old guard, I probably won't feel very safe being there, because consent is handled differently. They have kinks and fetishes that don't necessarily align with things that I would be familiar with or comfortable with. And frankly, I would rather just not put myself in that situation, because I also feel like the second I enter a munch, I'm oftentimes being objectified by older Gold Guard members who are looking at me as though they can train me into a good slave or something, or it'd be fun to break me into a good slave. And that kind of mindset isn't something you see modern dynamics. But it's something I run into a lot with old guard members. And a lot of the creepy messages I get on Facebook, they're older old guard members who are like, I think it'd be really fun to break a sprat like you and make you a well behaved little slave. Well, that's not really how this works. What you're discussing is psychological and physical torture to break my spirit, which is not within the realms of kink. That's literally just torture and
Yeah.
abuse. If your
And then,
entire thing about a brat is that you want to break them to make them behave a certain way, you don't want a brat. What you want is that person who is already a slave or a service sub to act like a brat so you can role play breaking them.
yeah. And it's like the only way you should ever be acting to try and like change your partner is like in beneficial for them ways that they want to change, kind of
Yes,
ways. like
that they
like
have asked you to, consented to, and are fully aware of the mechanisms you're going to use to achieve
m-
that.
making sure your sub is drinking their water is a very popular trope for that exact reason. That is a good thing to be making sure
Very much
someone is.
needed.
Hmm.
Yeah, and then eating their meals and whatnot, and and that extends
Taking
to
their
everything. Taking their
medications,
medication, working out
stopping
if they.
smoking. Stopping
That
smoking is
that's
a
a
big
big.
one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
cigarettes especially are fucking oof. But
Yes.
like it's all of that. And you can't be like, oh no, I don't like that you like the color purple, so I'm gonna make it so you like the color green, and I'm gonna break it until you're like that. Like, what? That just goes back to the whole, like, that is someone with raging untreated mental issues.
Yeah. Or if you look at a certain subtype of BDSM enjoyers, say like I'm, for instance, I'm a baby brat. Like I'm not fully little, but I do have little esque behaviors, and I'm a brat. I'm a sassy brat. I do service sub type stuff sometimes. That's not my primary focus at all. But if you were to come up to me and be like, "Oh, you're a good brat. I like you, but I think what I'm going to do is break you and turn you into a full service sub slave," I'm going to assume you're a psychopath. And I think that's a pretty reasonable thing to assume, because you should not want to break somebody and make them different from who they are. You don't get into a relationship with somebody to completely alter their personality and mold it to your benefit. Even with a slave dynamic where that person wants to be your slave and like controlled by you or owned by you, if you're setting out to completely change their personality, you're not a dom, you're a psychopath. That's not
Yeah.
okay. None
like,
of that is okay. And that person, if your entire purpose is to break that person from who they are and completely change their personality, how the fuck can they consent to that if that's not the same person they're going to be at the end?
yeah,
By
and
the
never
very
never mind what
nature
that
of that.
says about your reason for getting into that relationship or dynamic to begin with. Because if you don't like anything about who they are as a person, why would you even be consenting to do anything to them to begin with? You know what I mean? Like, everyone that isn't
Yeah.
exactly the way you want them does not exist as a doll for you to transform into the person you want. Everyone has their own lives, their own personalities. And if it's like, oh, I don't like you as a person, I'm going to change you entirely, that is just so fucked in like every possible way. And that is
Yeah.
unfortunately that is a large part of old guard doming, was like, you're mine and you have no privacy, as we discussed, and I'm gonna mold you into what I want you to be, and not like a good, healthy, helpful self-care kind of way, but no, I'm gonna shatter everything you believe and everything you have self-confidence in, and I'm just gonna, make you depend only on my validation. And they're and
Yeah.
that's not limited to kink and dynamic. Like I said, that is something that happens even in totally vanilla relationships. People have that expectation of, you
Hmm.
have to adhere to what I want out of this, you have to adhere to what I want you to be, and it's just wrong on every possible level.
Yes. And I think that we have to be aware when we see these things. Some people in our generation will be like, well, I mean, it works for them. Why should we give them a bad time about it? We should give them a bad time about it because a lot of times the people who are in these dynamics don't realize that it is 100% abusive, that it doesn't fit within the realm of kink. And just because they say and they've been practicing it for 40 years doesn't make it okay. In fact, there's a lot of things that were done for 40 plus years that are very much so wrong, as we now know. Why does BDSM get a pass? As the newer generation of BDSM, we need to be able to look at these things, call them out, and recognize when these behaviors are not okay. And we need to be loud about it. We need to be upfront about it. And we need to be open about the conversation of why these things are no longer okay.
The
And
concept of it was a different time
exactly, it
does
doesn't
it
matter.
make it okay.
Exactly. It does not matter at the end of the day. I don't care if you have been in a dozen dynamics where each and every single one of them didn't allow you to have a safe word. Like, I had this one lady that was going back and forth with me. She's like, "Are you kink shaming me because I don't want to have a safe word?" Not kink shaming you, because that would have to be a kink. First of all, it's not possible to kink shame you for that. But I am telling you that that is abusive and that does not actually fall within kink. If you can't stop, and she said, "Oh, well, my dog lets me stop, but he has to decide whether or not it's worth stopping for, and then he'll decide what to do about it." Sweetie, that is abuse. That is abuse. You should have the say in if you can keep going or not. If you're calling stop, I don't think I can keep going. You can consult with them and they can give their input and think that you can take more. But at the end of the day, if you don't think you can take more, you should be able to completely stop the scene or change something according to how you feel is necessary. If not, that is not something you are capable of consenting to. If you cannot revoke consent, you cannot consent. End of the
Yeah.
day, period. And we need to be very upfront and honest and insistent upon calling this out, because I've seen it so much and we can't keep normalizing it. It is just abusive behavior. And it's deeply concerning to me. The fact that this keeps happening and I keep seeing these conversations, the old guard is on their way out. There's 40 something plus or 40-year-old members now who are part of the new guard, and we need to start being honest and open and upfront and making sure that the resources out there reflect modern thoughts on consent and what BDSM should be and how to practice it safely, because a lot of the things that are out there right now are not actually indicative of what safe consensual BDSM looks like, and that's upsetting.
Yep. And I would say it's just indicative of how, we view relationships just in general. Because I mean, it's that whole Disney thing, right? When it comes to vanilla, in vanilla terms here of relationships, people have this fake, super romantic, super unbelievable soulmate kind of view of romance, and there's a lot of people that grow up thinking that that's normal, that's what they should be looking for. I had a very harsh reckoning when I was, an older teenager going into my 20s about that.
Hmm.
And then you bring that into kink, and then people have very, old style, I'm not, this is not Disney, but I'm going to say Disney style level expectations towards kink where, I believe someone should be totally submissive or totally dominant and you should have total
Hmm.
control or have to give up total control to someone else. And it's exactly the same in kink that it is in real life, where that's just not realistic. And that is not really how that works at all. And if you're going into this with those expectations, you're going to have those expectations shattered, or you're
Hmm.
going to seriously be harming the people that you're trying to put those expectations on.
As
And
with any
it's
relationship, you both have
exact.
to learn and grow. You both have to learn and grow the entire time. If not, you're not in a relationship, you're stagnant. And that's not good for anybody.
Nope, not good at all. And the worst part of it is the sunk cost fallacy part of this, because I'm sure there will be people listening to this who have been in that situation, or maybe you're in that situation right now. And it's, if the other person is that off in regards to their expectations and their beliefs as to what is right, where they believe they should have total control, or they are being super weird vanilla-y love bombing kind of, there's only one, you're my soulmate, blah 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 blah, I'll kill myself if you go, that kind of thing. Like that's not healthy. And you've already hit the point where you can say this is not going to improve if they're not going to fix themselves. Sunk cost
Exactly.
fallacy, you have this expectation, oh, I've already put time into this, I've already put effort into this, so maybe if I put more time and more effort, things will improve. And if someone
Hmm.
is that abusive towards you, an actual relationship or power dynamic, unless they are actively working on fixing themselves, it is not going to get better. If you're listening to this right now and you're in that, just get out, and go, because that is not something that's going to improve unless they work on it. And you're just harming yourself by staying there. And anyone that enters into one of those relationships not understanding that's what's happening, you're unfortunately, they're going to be harming themselves if they haven't done the research, if
Hmm.
they don't know that that's something that's toxic and not real.
Exactly. One of the big things that you mentioned that I wanted to like mention again, it's not technically related, but you said something about this Disney idea of like a submission should be fully submissive. I actually want to say an opinion that I have gathered over a couple of years. I actually think there's a lot fewer people who are fully submissive or dominant than they think they are. I think there's a lot of people who have switchy tendencies and they don't actually realize it, because you can be more or less dominant or submissive with every single partner you play with. The more partners you have, the more likely you are to notice this. I am pretty extreme on the subby spectrum, and I've yet to find anybody I'm dommy towards without like having to really physically fake it. But I have met a lot of subs who I thought were super, super subby, and they come to me one day and they're like, Mouse, I think I might be a little bit dommy. And I'm going, really? But then I see them in this dynamic with this other person, and for some reason or another, that person who's usually so dominant was subby with them all of a sudden. And I think that there's a lot of argument to be made that just because you are a dom or just because you are a sub doesn't mean that you're going to have that role all the time. And if you are going into a dynamic with somebody who is that inflexible, you're just not going to be able to learn and grow. Like you just won't. You won't be able to have
Yep.
that self growth. And a lot of times it's the healthier relationships that I see where somebody learns that they're a little switchy and they did not know that before. Or they learn that they've got a little bit of a dominant side they didn't know they had. And usually it's because that's a really safe and healthy relationship where they've had a chance to try it or they felt safe trying it. Because they didn't go into that relationship with the full on expectation they were always going to be a submissive. There was room for them to grow and they managed to find that in themselves. And I love that. I really do, because for me, when somebody tells me they recently discovered in a scene that they could be dominant, I'm just like, yes, babe, good for you. I am so glad you felt safe and healthy enough to learn that about yourself. That's incredible. I absolutely love that. If you are in a dynamic and you don't feel like you have the space to learn more about yourself, I've got bad news for you. You probably shouldn't be in that dynamic. That is a dynamic that is suffocating you, not permitting you to learn and grow and evolve and be what you want to be in the future. And if that person is no longer permitting you to learn and grow, then you're stagnant and you're both harming yourselves by staying there.
I think that all goes back into where flexibility is really the big thing, behind kink too. Nobody knows really what exactly they're into when they first step into it. I sure the hell didn't, and I'm still learning stuff about
Oh yeah.
what exactly I like, what I don't like when it comes to kink. It's a one day at a time type thing. I always try to be open. If you find something to be a hard no for you, you don't want to attempt to try it, communicate that.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, you don't have to be disrespectful with it. Some people do enjoy it. That's okay. It's just not for you. But that's your boundary. That is for you. And that's what kink is about. Is you, and if you have a partner during a scene, not everything has to be with a partner either. And when you're practicing different kink things, it's just finding out what you're comfortable with.
Yeah, and it's a big part of even our relationships is that not everyone and every kink is everything for every person. You can get things from certain kinks, then get other things from other kinks. It's the same way as you can get certain types of friendships out of some friends and certain types of friendships out of others, and certain people can be your vault, and other people can be let's go out and do fun stuff friend. Like not everyone is everything, and that's the exact same kind of weird rotten expectation you traditionally see in vanilla relationships, where someone's like, oh, I should be your everything, you don't need to talk to other people, you don't need to do this and that, why am I not the person you're going to for fun, why am I not the blah 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 blah. It's like, no. You can have other friends that do other things. You can have relationships that have other meanings to them outside of the person you're with. And it's the same thing in dynamics too. Just because you might like one kink for this reason, you might like another kink for another reason. You might have a dynamic with one person, in a completely different way than you have, a dynamic with another person. It's just that's just life. Not that's a hell of an expectation to have for one person or one kink that is just going to be perfect and everything you need every time. It's just not realistic. It's not how things.
Wholly agreed. It gets really, really frustrating within a dynamic if you go in and there's an expectation that things will not change, because that's not a reflection of reality or humanity. Things within humanity and things within reality are not and will never be stagnant. So you should be entering a dynamic friendship, any type of relationship, with the understanding that things will change over time. And you can't necessarily just count on things to never change or expect them to, fix themselves for you if they have changed and go back to the way they were before, because that's not really rational. I mean, sometimes they could, but sometimes as people, because of this development of change, we do tend to grow apart, and that's not necessarily anyone's fault. It just happens. It's humanity. We are ever changing. Everything in life is ever changing. There are very few things that are constant. So when we enter dynamics, we should be aware that things will change. And I think this is a good way to really bring this full circle. BDSM has changed since the time of the old guard. They are practicing things the way that they were practiced 40 years ago, and that's just not okay anymore. It's like if you were treating people the same way you did in the 1970s now, wouldn't fucking fly in real life, would it? If you started talking to anyone, women, men, people of color, the way that people in the 1970s would have, you would end up with your ass kicked quickly.
Yeah,
We're
I'd
not
say
practicing BDSM. Yeah, we're not going to practice BDSM the way they did in the 70s, because that's not okay now.
I'd say
So
that's
your
a
whole
big part of
thing-
the old guard, is that whole boomer, like, no, this is the way it was, this is the way it should be, this is the
Exactly.
way it will always be, that inflexibility that they have.
Exactly. One of the things that I saw that I thought was comically poorly done recently was one of the older pages that is really into old guard BDSM posted a source from like 1969 about how slave dynamics should work. And I was like, bro, they weren't even like 100 years past when slavery was a thing. Maybe we shouldn't be taking them as gospel truth on how slavery and BDSM should be running, because that's like now, what, 80 years past when it was written? Like, we have had 80 years of growth. Well, not 80 years, my math's wrong. 60 years. My bad. 60 years
Still
of
hurt.
growth past then. Look, it hurts me too. Okay. That whole article is older than I am, and that doesn't make it legit. That makes it like really badly outdated. within BDSM and this type of like behavioral thing, we are not looking for something that is written in the 1940s to tell us how to like do proper, bratting or something. And very little about what we did in the 1940s would be okay today. Very little of what we did in the 1970s is okay today. So why do you think that your BDSM that you're basing off of articles from 1970 is okay or should still stand up or, has quote unquote stood the test of time? No, it hasn't. That's why most people don't practice it anymore because it's outdated and kind of fucking weird. Okay. Let's just recognize it for what it is. It's kind of
Yep.
fucking weird that you're basing like Gurion. It's based off of a sci-fi novel from the 1970s or something that was just fucking weird. And I think I read somewhere the whole fixation on this like slave girls of was like based off of like the fact that in this book less than 5% of all women on this planet were enslaved that way, and somehow that was like the one thing you took from that book. Like,
Wild.
okay, I guess. Like, big incel energy for me right there, but okay. Like, if you read a book from the 1970s, the only thing you took away was like a tiny population of that planet was used as sex slaves, and you thought that the whole aesthetic was just how you were going to live your entire life. Kind of sounds like you might need
that's yeah, I was gonna say it's a very common mental health thing where people fixate on something so completely weird and then they make it like their entire personality. That's
Yeah, I'm pretty glad you guys found a community like online where you don't have to inflict this upon regular women who may not want it, but like recognize that it shouldn't probably be mainstream anymore, and there's a reason it's not. We definitely have taken pieces of it that we all kind of like the slave poses, the presenting poses, the inspection, like the slave inspections, like that's all kind of hot. We can all agree with that. We can all like incorporate that into other aspects of kink, but the entire dynamic of it isn't used anymore for a reason. There's a reason we took the pieces we liked and left the rest of it behind. And it's not because we're new and we're going to have to learn or we're not respecting the old ways. We respect you just fine. We just wanted you to stay in the 70s instead of being here too.
Yeah.
Like that should have stayed in the 70s where it belongs. Should have stayed in the 80s where it belongs. Like after 2000, that really didn't have any business being in kink still. Not after we had this whole conversation on what consent looks like. Not after, I want to say like the advent of the internet when consent became discussed at a higher level of frequency. Because consent really became a bigger topic of discussion when hundreds of people could talk about it at the same time. Like once we had the ability to discuss things, all of a sudden consent becomes a major topic. And we start to see more of an emphasis on kink being all built around consent. And if the kink that you were really into from like the 1980s doesn't fit that mold, that's probably why nobody really talks about it anymore. Because why would you if you can't be safely consented to?
Yes, indeed.
And I think that we need to recognize that there's a reason that some of these things aren't used in the modern era anymore. It's because we probably looked at it and as a community recognized that it was problematic and we didn't want to keep it. So you just don't see people using it anymore. Yep, and I would argue very strongly
that you're hopefully seeing less people take their doors away from their kids.
Yes, exactly. We don't need slave dynamics that are 24/7 where even the tiniest shred of privacy is a gift. Bro, go to fucking therapy. What you need is therapy, not a slave. Let's be very real here. No you don't need to inflict this upon a poor person who's just trying to make you happy. They shouldn't have to be punished for having a personality that doesn't perfectly align with your will. That just means you need therapy. Badly. Like so fucking badly. Find a kink-friendly therapist and tell them what issues you have. Namely, these issues about needing to control somebody's ability to defecate and like have a little bit of privacy. It's not a gift. That is their autonomy that they have every right to. And if they choose to give it to you for short periods of time or even for a 24/7 dynamic, it's still theirs to take back, and you need to fucking recognize that, or you're not actually consenting. And they're not actually consenting.
Indeed. All right. With that said, we are now over time. And I think we did a pretty good job this episode, especially talking about the old guard.
Time to get some time and a half.
Yes.
Yeah. Where's my time and a half then? what is going to be next episode's topic? What are we discussing in 2 weeks? What do you guys?
I started thinking about what was I talking about there? The switchiness, like how a lot of people are switches without realizing they're switches. And I think that it would be interesting to talk about how dynamics can change over time and how that's okay, but I'm not really sure if that would constitute a full episode. What else do you think we could add on to that?
Mm. I know we had been talking in the server about kink in like media as well.
Yes, that is one I wanted to discuss too, like the stereotypes that we mentioned earlier about leather and things like that. The stereotypes in kink versus how they actually are within kink.
We'll put a peg. Haha. We'll put a peg in the
Of course, you'd put a peg
changing
in something,
dynamics.
please.
Yeah, of course. And we'll think about that. We'll think about how to make that a full episode, and we'll do because I really wanted to talk about that too.
I
So we'll do
I did
portrayals of kink in
mention.
media for
I also
the
think we
next
should bring
episode.
in porn for that one too, because a
Oh
lot of the
well,
Mm-hmm.
kinks that you
absolutely.
see in porn are completely different from how
Oh,
they're actually
absolutely.
practicing BDSM.
That is just as much media as anything else.
Yeah,
So portrayals of kink in media that falls under that branch to me. So we'll
perfect.
absolutely throw that in there too. So we'll see you guys in 2 weeks. I hope you guys enjoyed, and thanks for chatting with us as the episode was going on. And if you ever need to find other episodes, just Google Starbright Podcast. You'll find the link right there. I think it's the first result, if I'm not mistaken. And there's links to some social medias down below, links to the Discord where we hang out and record these episodes. If you want to hang out and chat with us there too. And follow us, throw us a like if you enjoyed what you're listening to, and have a good one, everybody. See you in 2
All
weeks.
right. Bye, guys.